June 21, 1941. Along a front stretching more than 2,900 kilometers, 3 million German soldiers wait in silence. Engines muted, artillery covered, radios quiet. An army larger than anything Europe had ever seen stands ready to strike. On the other side of the border, the Soviet Union sleeps. What the world is about to witness is not simply an invasion. It is the beginning of the largest military operation in human history. An attack that Adolf Hitler believed would destroy the Soviet Union in just 10 weeks. This operation had a code name, Barbarossa. To understand the scale of Barbarossa, we must understand why Hitler wanted the East. From the moment he wrote Mein Kampf, Hitler obsessed over a single idea, Lebensraum, living space. He believed Germany needed vast lands to expand its population, grow its food, and fuel its empire. For him, there was only one place large enough to take, the Soviet Union. But there were deeper reasons. Destroying communism, securing Ukraine's wheat fields, capturing Caucasus oil, eliminating the Red Army before it became stronger. Hitler believed the USSR was a colossus with feet of clay. One strong blow and it would collapse. He was wrong. But in 1941, nobody knew that. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin believed the opposite. He thought Hitler would never attack while Britain was still fighting. He believed that Germany feared a two-front war. And so, despite warnings from British intelligence, German deserters, Soviet spies, even his own generals, Stalin dismissed them all. When his top spy, Richard Sorge, sent a telegraph saying, Germany will invade the Soviet Union on June 22nd. Stalin said, disinformation. Germany is not that foolish. He was very wrong. By spring 1941, Hitler positioned 3.3 million German troops, 3,600 tanks, 600,000 vehicles, 2,700 aircraft supported by Romania, Finland, Hungary, Italy, and Slovakia. This would be the largest land offensive in human history. Germany divided its forces into three massive army groups. Army Group North goal: capture Leningrad. Army Group Center goal: destroy the Red Army in Belarus. Then take Moscow. Army Group South goal: seize Ukraine's farmland and industry. Each had hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of guns, and armored spearheads, ready to punch through Soviet lines. Hitler believed the Soviet Union would collapse like France and Poland. He thought the campaign would end before winter. That single belief would cost Germany everything. On the night of June 21st, German soldiers opened sealed envelopes revealing the final orders. The German armed forces will crush the Soviet Union in a lightning campaign. Along the front, Wehrmacht soldiers quietly cut barbed wire, moved artillery into firing position, and waited for dawn. Soviet guards noticed movements, but their commanders ordered them not to fire. Stalin still believed Germany would not attack. At 3:15 a.m., June 22, 1941, the German artillery opened fire. A wall of explosions lit up the Soviet border from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The earth shook. Buildings collapsed. Entire Soviet outposts were wiped out in seconds. Then the sky filled with German aircraft. Luftwaffe bombers struck Soviet air bases, destroying over 1,200 Soviet planes, most of them on the ground. Within the first hour, the Soviet Air Force in the western USSR was nearly gone. Stalin's disbelief had just turned into a nightmare. Dawn fades into morning as June 22, 1941 unfolds. Along a 1,800-mile front, the largest invasion force in human history pushes forward. 3 million German soldiers, 600,000 horses, 750,000 vehicles, all crossing into Soviet territory. For the first 48 hours, The Wehrmacht advances at a pace that even Hitler did not expect. The Soviet collapse BG German. Armored spearheads slice deep into Belarus and Ukraine. The Soviet border defenses, caught off guard, poorly coordinated, begin to crumble under the pressure. In the north, Army Group North races toward the Baltic. In the center, Army Group Center smashes through Soviet lines with terrifying speed. In the south, Army Group South pushes toward the rich farmlands of Ukraine, facing heavier resistance. But everywhere, the same story repeats. Soviet units taken by surprise. Communication lines shattered. Commanders isolated. Entire divisions unable to receive new orders. Inside the Soviet ranks, panic spreads. Thousands of aircraft are caught on the ground during the first Luftwaffe strikes. One Soviet soldier later recalled, they came in waves. 3, 4, 5 attacks. Our planes burned like torches. There was nowhere to hide. By the end of the first day, nearly 1,200 Soviet aircraft are destroyed, most of them without ever taking off. Stalin himself refuses to believe the scale of the disaster. He thinks Hitler's attack is a rogue action. For hours, he gives no clear orders. Entire armies wait and die. In silence, the Germans unleash their most dangerous weapon, the pincer movement. Fast, coordinated attacks designed to trap entire Soviet armies near Białystok and Minsk. Armored divisions sweep around the Soviet flanks. Infantry divisions follow behind, closing the trap. In just the first week, the Germans surround nearly 300,000 Soviet soldiers. Many try to break out. Most fail. The roads are filled with scenes of desperation. Abandoned tanks with no fuel, Soviet infantry marching without ammunition, commanders searching for units that no longer exist. This is Blitzkrieg at its peak. Speed of the advance shocks even German generals. Some truly believe the Soviet Union will collapse in a matter of weeks. War diaries from the time read, "The enemy is beaten. Victory is only a matter of time." Berlin celebrates too early. Hitler believes he has already won. But deep inside the Soviet Union, a force is gathering that no one in the German high command fully understands. A force that will change the course of the entire war. By late June, the initial shock begins to fade. Fresh Soviet units, many undertrained, poorly equipped, rush toward the front. But these new troops fight with a ferocity the Germans did not expect. One German officer writes, "They came at us endlessly. Their losses were unimaginable, but still they came." In some towns, Soviet soldiers fight to the last man. In others, civilians join the battle-digging trenches, building barricades, preparing their homes for street fighting. The war is no longer fast and easy. It is beginning to slow. But the German advance continues. As June becomes July, Army Group Center pushes forward with tremendous speed. Their next target, Smolensk, a gateway city on the road to Moscow. The pincer movements return. Once again, Soviet armies are surrounded. By mid-July, another 300,000 Soviet soldiers are encircled. The Red Army bleeds, but it does not break. Something is changing. The Germans keep winning battles, but the Soviets keep replacing their losses. For every division destroyed, Stalin forms 2 more. For every tank lost, Soviet factories try to build another. Barbarossa is still moving forward. But for the first time, it meets resistance that refuses to die. The German war machine pushes deeper into the Soviet Union. The distances grow longer. The supply lines grow thinner. And the clock is ticking. Ahead lies Moscow. But between the Germans and victory stands something far deadlier than the Red Army. The Russian summer is ending, and the brutal Soviet winter is coming. By early July 1941, 3 weeks into Operation Barbarossa, the German High Command believed victory was already within reach. They had advanced over 600 kilometers into Soviet territory. Entire Soviet armies had been surrounded and destroyed. Cities fell one after another: Minsk, Vilnius, Riga, Smolensk. The Wehrmacht looked unstoppable, but beneath the surface, the seeds of disaster were already forming. Hitler expected the Soviet Union to fall like France. A quick, decisive campaign. A shattered enemy. A toppled government. But Stalin had no intention of surrendering. Within days of the invasion, he ordered, "We must fight to the last man." From across the vast Soviet Union, new armies were formed. Hundreds of thousands of fresh soldiers, many with barely any training. Workers left factories, students left classrooms, elderly men volunteered. All to defend the motherland. The German army suddenly realized they were not fighting a country. They were fighting an entire civilization, ready to die. The Germans had planned Barbarossa to last no more than 8 to 10 weeks. Enough time to conquer the west of the USSR before weather became a factor. But by late July, the skies began to shift. Heavy rains swept across Belarus and Ukraine. Rivers overflowed. Roads turned into deep mud, the same mud that would later haunt the Germans in October. The Wehrmacht's tanks and trucks sank axle deep. Supplies moved slower. Fuel was delayed. Food was scarce. And while the Germans bogged down in the mud, the Soviets used every hour to regroup. Hitler expected the people of the Soviet Union to greet him as a liberator. Instead, German brutality in the first weeks of occupation sparked one of the largest partisan movements in history. Entire forests in Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia became resistance centers. Partisans sabotaged railroads, burned supply depots, and ambushed convoys. Every kilometer the Germans advanced, their supply lines stretched thinner. And the number of attacks grew. A German officer wrote in his diary, "The land behind us is on fire. We do not control it. We only pass through it." The Blitzkrieg was meant to be fast, clean, unstoppable. Instead, the Germans found themselves bleeding from 1,000 cuts. Perhaps the most critical turning point of the entire campaign was not on the battlefield, but inside Hitler's own mind. As July progressed, Hitler became obsessed with all three objectives at once: Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, Ukraine and the Caucasus in the south. His generals begged him to focus on Moscow. The Soviet capital was the heart of the railway network, the symbol of Soviet power, and the key to victory. But Hitler refused. He issued a new order. Army Group Center's tanks would be split up and sent in opposite directions. Half would go north, half would go south. This was a catastrophic decision. The Germans lost momentum. Precious time was wasted. Fuel was wasted. Manpower stretched thinner. A German general later said, "At that moment, we lost the war." While Hitler argued with his generals, Stalin launched a massive counteroffensive around Smolensk, despite heavy losses. The Soviets managed to slow the German advance, the first real sign that Blitzkrieg was failing in the east. For the first time since the invasion began, German soldiers wrote home saying, "The Russians do not stop coming." The German timetable shattered. The Wehrmacht was now 3 weeks behind schedule. And every day lost brought them closer to something Hitler had not planned for: the Russian winter. By August 1941, the cost of Barbarossa was staggering. Germany had already lost 400,000 men killed or wounded, over 2,000 tanks destroyed or broken, thousands of trucks abandoned, ammunition shortages in multiple armies. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union suffered far worse. Millions were dead, wounded, or captured, and yet the Red Army kept growing. Factories from the west were dismantled piece by piece and transported thousands of kilometers east, beyond German reach. Within weeks, entire industrial cities appeared out of nothing. Tank factories rose in the Ural Mountains. Artillery plants appeared in Siberia. The Soviet Union was preparing for a long war. Germany was not dot by late August. The Blitzkrieg had slowed to a crawl. Instead of a quick knockout blow, Germany now faced a massive, endless conflict across thousands of kilometers of unforgiving terrain. The Wehrmacht was still dangerous, but no longer unstoppable. And yet, Hitler believed he could still win. He ordered the next phase of the campaign, the march on Kiev, and the final push toward Moscow. But fate had already turned. Operation Barbarossa was no longer a lightning war bout. It was becoming a war of attrition. The exact type of war Germany could not win. August 1941, 2 months into Operation Barbarossa. Hitler is convinced that victory is only weeks away. Berlin prepares for celebrations. German newspapers speak confidently of a collapsing Soviet Union. But on the front lines, the truth is very different. German supply routes now stretch hundreds of kilometers across hostile territory. Every day, panzer divisions outrun their own supply columns. Fuel runs low. Ammunition runs low. Tank engines break down after thousands of kilometers of continuous movement. Soldiers who once advanced 40 miles a day now advance less than 5, and another enemy begins to rise. The Soviet partisan movement behind German lines. Soviet civilians, farmers, workers, teenagers form small resistance cells. They blow up train tracks, ambush convoys, destroy fuel depots. Each attack slows the German advance just enough to matter. The Wehrmacht is no longer fighting one enemy, but two. In July 1941, the Germans expected to capture Smolensk in days. Instead, they were dragged into a 2-month battle. The Soviet 16th, 19th, and 20th Armies fight with a desperation the Germans did not expect. For the first time, Hitler's generals begin to worry. The Soviets are not collapsing. They are getting stronger. Soviet reinforcements pour in from the east. Factories from Western Russia are packed onto trains and move piece by piece into the Ural Mountains. Out of German reach, the Red Army is learning. The Red Army is adapting. And the Red Army is not giving up. Smolensk becomes a symbol, the first major delay in Barbarossa. By August 1941, German commanders plead to push straight for Moscow. They believe a direct strike could end the war before winter. But Hitler disagrees, obsessed with capturing resources. He orders, Army Group South gives Ukraine, Army Group North gives Leningrad, Army Group Center gives halt its advance toward Moscow. The generals are furious. They know dividing the forces weakens the entire front. But Hitler insists, we must seize the economic heart of the Soviet Union before taking the capital. This decision becomes one of the most critical mistakes of the war, because while the Germans turn south, the Soviets rebuild the defenses of Moscow. The Germans now move toward Kiev, not Moscow. Tactically, Germany wins a massive victory, one of the largest encirclements in military history. Over 600,000 Soviet troops are captured, but it comes at a cost. Weeks are lost. Fuel is burned. Equipment is worn down. And the weather begins to shift. Rain falls. Temperatures drop. The ground transforms into a swamp of thick, sucking mud. The infamous Rasputissa, the season of mud, begins. Panzer treads spin uselessly. Horses sink to their knees. Vehicles must be dragged by entire platoons. The Wehrmacht, once unstoppable, moves slower than a man on foot. The road to Moscow is now drowning in mud. While the Germans struggle. Stalin makes a daring decision. He transfers Siberian divisions fully equipped, experienced, and winter-trained thousands of kilometers west. These troops were originally holding the border with Japan, but Soviet intelligence, thanks to spy Richard Sorge, reports that Japan will not invade the USSR. This changes everything. For the first time, Stalin has the manpower to defend Moscow properly. By late September 1941, the weather worsens again. Cold rain turns into sleet. Sleet turns into snow. Snow melts into mud once more. The Germans are exhausted, hungry, sick, and freezing. Their summer uniforms offer no protection against the cold. Many soldiers wrap newspapers around their boots to stay warm. And yet, Hitler demands one final push, one last advance. The drive on Moscow begins. Operation Typhoon. But the German army is no longer the unstoppable force of June. Their tanks are worn. Their supply lines are broken. Their troops are exhausted. And the Red Army is waiting. By December 1941, the Nazi war machine, once unstoppable, had reached its limit. The German advance had slowed, then stalled, and finally frozen in place. Hitler's troops were not prepared for the Russian winter. Their tanks refused to start. Their machine guns jammed. Fuel froze in their lines, and men, thousands of them, were collapsing from frostbite. Yet, even as the German offensive ground to a halt, the Red Army was rising again. From deep in the Far East, from the frozen edges of Siberia, Stalin called upon his most elite forces, troops hardened by brutal winters. Trained for Arctic warfare, these were the Siberian divisions. Commanded by Marshal Zhukov, they arrived fully equipped. White winter uniforms, skis, submachine guns, heavy artillery, fresh tanks. This was no longer a defensive war. This was a counterstrike. On the morning of December 5, 1941, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive across a 600-mile front. The exhausted German army, low on fuel, ammunition, and warm clothing, was hit with overwhelming force. Soviet infantry charged through the snow. T-34 tanks rolled forward reliably, unlike the German panzers. Katyusha rocket launchers screamed across the battlefield. The Red Army pushed the Germans 40 to 100 miles back from Moscow. For the first time in the war, Hitler's forces were not advancing. They were retreating. Panic spread along the German lines. Units were cut off. Vehicles were abandoned. Men froze to their rifles while standing guard. Entire divisions reported 70% casualty rates from both combat and the cold. General Heinz Guderian wrote in his diary, "We are facing a catastrophe. My tanks will not move. My men can barely hold a rifle." The myth of the invincible German army was shattered on the snow-covered outskirts of Moscow. Furious with his generals, Hitler made a catastrophic decision. He took complete personal control of the German army. He forbade retreats. No matter how hopeless, no matter how deadly, Hitler declared, "The German army will stand fast." No step backward. But standing still meant dying. German units froze in place literally, while the Soviets continued to attack. It was the beginning of the end. Historians often say, the winter saved Russia, but that's only half the truth. Germany's real problems were no winter clothing, frozen fuel, frozen machine guns, summer uniforms. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles. No food for soldiers, no shelter against 30 degrees Celsius temperatures. Meanwhile, the Soviets had proper winter training, ski troops, winter oil for vehicles, factories producing supplies non-stop, reinforcements from across the USSR. In short, Germany was dying from exposure. The Soviet Union was gaining strength. By January 1942, the Germans had lost over 750,000 men. Their Blitzkrieg, once unstoppable, was gone forever. For the first time since Hitler began his conquest of Europe, the Allies had hoped. Operation Barbarossa had failed. And the Eastern Front, now awakened, would become the graveyard of the Nazi Empire. December 1941. Temperatures across the Eastern Front plunged to -30 degrees Celsius, -40 degrees Celsius. even minus 50 degrees Celsius. Oil freezes inside engines. Metal snaps. Weapons jam. Soldiers suffer frostbite even through their gloves. The German army, once unstoppable, is now immobilized at the gates of Moscow. They had come within 15 miles of the Soviet capital. Hitler believed victory was close enough to touch, but the reality was the opposite. Germany had run out of time, out of supplies, out of strength, out of strategic direction. December 5, 1941, General Georgy Zhukov launches a massive Soviet counterattack. Fresh troops from Siberia, trained, equipped, and hardened for winter warfare, flood the lines. The Red Army strikes the exhausted Germans simultaneously across a 600-mile front. For the first time in the entire war, Hitler's armies begin to retreat, not by order, not by strategy, but by pure necessity. The invincible Wehrmacht is pushed back dozens of miles from Moscow. Entire divisions are shattered. Momentum belongs to the Soviets now. Humiliated and furious, Hitler makes a fateful decision. He dismisses his generals. He abolishes strategic debate. He declares himself the supreme commander of the war. From this moment on, military decisions would no longer be based on logic, logistics, or reality, but on ideology and emotion. Operation Barbarossa, once the largest invasion ever attempted in human history, had officially failed. Historians point to four core reasons. 1. Underestimating the Soviet Union. Hitler believed the USSR would collapse in weeks. He was wrong. 2. Logistics. Germany did not have enough trucks, rail capacity, spare parts, or winter clothing. 3. The winter the Germans planned for a 12-week campaign, not a 6-month war. 4. Soviet resilience. The USSR absorbed staggering losses and kept fighting. Factories moved east. New armies were raised. The Red Army learned, adapted, and evolved. In just 6 months, over 4 million German and Axis soldiers entered the USSR. 750,000 became casualties. The Soviets lost millions of soldiers and civilians. Entire cities burned. Villages ceased to exist. The Eastern Front became the deadliest battlefield in human history. Operation Barbarossa was supposed to give Hitler total domination of Europe. Instead, it destroyed the German army's strength, consumed resources, and opened a front Germany could never close. The decision to invade the Soviet Union was the decision that doomed Nazi Germany. From the winter of 1941 onward, one truth was clear: Germany would never again regain the initiative. The road to Stalingrad, Berlin, and the end began here. Barbarossa had failed, and with it, Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year empire began to crumble. December 20th, 1941. The temperature outside Moscow has dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in seconds. German engines refuse to start. Lubricants turn solid. Weapons jam. Soldiers wearing light summer uniforms wrap themselves in curtains, tablecloths, anything they can tear from abandoned Soviet homes. The Wehrmacht, once feared across Europe, now finds itself immobilized, starving and exhausted. Meanwhile, the Red Army, reinforced with fresh Siberian troops, pushes forward with relentless determination. These men are skilled winter fighters, armed with warm clothing, prepared equipment, and a morale hardened by desperation. Germany's advance, once unstoppable, finally shatters. German high command realizes the truth inside military headquarters. Panic spreads. Hitler refuses to allow any retreats. His orders are absolute: stand fast. Not one step back. But his generals know the truth. 750,000 German casualties, 28,000 vehicles lost. Supply lines stretched over 1,000 kilometers. Ammunition shortages everywhere. thousands suffering frostbite every single day. Operation Barbarossa, designed to destroy the Soviet Union in 3 months, has become a catastrophic miscalculation. Soviet counteroffensive. The tide turns on December 5, 1941. The Red Army launches a massive counterattack along the entire Moscow front. For the first time since the invasion began, the Soviets push the Germans back, sometimes 30 to 150 kilometers. German soldiers, lacking winter clothing, collapse from cold before enemy fire even reaches them. Entire divisions are forced into chaotic retreats, something unheard of. In the early war, Barbarossa has failed, the moment the war changed forever by. Early January 1942. Hitler reluctantly accepts what he had refused to believe. The Soviet Union will not fall. The war in the East will not be quick. The German army is no longer fighting for victory, but for survival. Hitler removes his most experienced generals, replaces them with loyal but unqualified officers, and takes personal control of military decisions. It is a turning point that will drive Germany into disaster. The failure of Barbarossa forces Hitler into a long, grinding war of attrition, a type of war Germany cannot win. Across the vast Eastern Front, suffering continues on a scale the world has rarely witnessed. Villages burned, civilians massacred, prisoners starved, entire landscapes transformed into graveyards. Operation Barbarossa is not just a military failure. It becomes one of the darkest chapters in human history. By winter's end, the truth is undeniable. Germany will never again regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union, once on the brink of collapse, emerges stronger, fueled by rage, unity, and unimaginable sacrifice. 3 years later, the Red Army marches across Eastern Europe, breaking through German lines, winning battle after battle, until finally, in May 1945, the ruins of Berlin bring the war in Europe to an end. It all began with Barbarossa, an invasion built on arrogance, fueled by racism, and doomed by a catastrophic misunderstanding of the Soviet people. Closing. Narration. Operation Barbarossa was not simply a military campaign. It was the moment that sealed the fate of Nazi Germany. What began as Hitler's boldest gamble ended as the first great crack in the Nazi war machine, a crack that would widen until the entire empire collapsed. The Eastern Front would go on to become the deadliest theater in human history, but its ending was written here. In the winter of 1941, when Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, finally met a force it could not defeat, the unbreakable will of the Soviet nation.